All right, well, good morning. So Brother Phil is away this week, so I'm filling in for him as kind of a one-off class. And I talked a little bit about this on Sunday. I've been going through a different kind of daily readings planner where instead of looking at the Bible in 1 year, it actually stretches it out over 5 years and allows you to go through a little bit more slowly and kind of learn, at least helps me learn things a little better. And one of the areas that it's in right now is in Isaiah. And so I've never really looked at this book in depth, and so I've been able to take some time to just understand Isaiah's prophecies a little bit better. And so this morning I just want to share a little bit about what I've learned so far in just studying Isaiah. And I'm basically up to chapter 8, so it's a big book. There's 66 chapters, so it's kind of an intimidating study sometimes because there's so much to wrap your head around. And so just hoping to talk about a little bit about Isaiah, some of the themes and maybe some of the lessons that you'll see in there. So I guess just starting off, Isaiah, his name means salvation of Yah. And like we said, this book it's a large book. It's 66 chapters. And Isaiah, you can get the idea, is very important to the New Testament writers because you'll see Isaiah is the most quoted prophet in the New Testament. And what you'll also see about Isaiah is that his literary skills, the way he writes, is just surpasses the other prophets in the Old Testament. Just the beauty and the poetry of his writing. It's very majestic. There's a lot of things that we think about. In Isaiah chapter 2, for example, has the famous passages that they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And some of his words are immortalized in statues around the world because of this. So Isaiah as the person, and we'll just take a minute to talk about that, is the time frame that he lived in. And you see that in verse 1. And it says that Isaiah lived in the days of Uzziah, of Jotham, of Ahaz, and Hezekiah, the kings of Judah. And so this is, I guess, chronologically speaking, in Judah's history, it's kind of towards the middle-ish of the kingdom. There's some problems going on with Assyria around the world at that time. Assyria is going to be a growing world power. They're going to be responsible for taking the northern kingdom of Israel and sending them off into exile. And the southern kingdom of Judah is jeopardized at one point. During the reign of Hezekiah, they come very close to being conquered by the Assyrians. But God miraculously intervenes and they're delivered. And they are allowed to persist for a period longer as a kingdom. And eventually, of course, they fall to the Babylonians. So that's where we are right now. We're going to go through the time period, and that's going to be a big picture, a big thing that's important in Isaiah is this invasion of the Assyrians and some of the things around that. Isaiah is a person. If you look at chapter 8, Isaiah chapter 8, you get a little bit of a picture of his family life. Isaiah chapter 8, verse 3, it tells us that I went to the prophetess and she conceived and bore a son. And so it gives us a little bit of hint about his wife was also a prophet. He refers to her as a prophetess. Another thing that's interesting about Isaiah is he has a couple of kids, and they have what we may call strange names. You have this son here in chapter 8 verse 1. His name is, 8 verse 3. He says, call his name Meher Shalal Hashbaz. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it? And then he has another son back in chapter 7. If you flip back one chapter and you look at verse 3, and Isaiah 7, verse 3, it says, the Lord chose Isaiah, go to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son. And so he has another son. And again, if you look at both of their names, they have some significance to them. The one son's name means, the son whose name Meher Shalal Hashbaz, it means speed the spoil, hasten the booty. And so his name is talking about how they're going to be invaded and their belongings are going to be taken. The other son, his name is Shear-Jashub, and his name means a remnant shall return. And again, if you look at chapter 8, verse 18, it tells us that, behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts who dwells on Mount Zion. So they are to be signs to the kingdom. So their names are very intentional. They were not just named because, hey, we think this is a pretty name. They were named that because their names had meaning prophetically for the kingdom, and they had a message. And so that tells us a little bit about his family. His family was very involved in prophecy in the work of the Lord. It wasn't just Isaiah. He had his wife and at least 2 sons who were involved in that.
A lot like Hosea and Mary and Gomer, and his 3 children all had specific names that were judgments on Israel. You know, they are not my children, no mercy, and not mine, I think were the 3.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So you said it's verse 18 of Isaiah 8, and then just marking it off.
So verse 18 of chapter 8 is where it tells us that it specifically says these are signs. It's not just like
the
a
children
coincidence.
are signs.
Yeah, I and my children are signs.
Okay, and that's Isaiah saying me and my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And where was the first kid born? You said chapter 7 somewhere?
7 verse 3, this is where he's sent to King Ahaz, and his first son is named Shear-Jashub, and his name means a remnant shall return. And then the next son is Isaiah chapter 8 verse 3, and that's the long name. It's hard to, Meher Shalal Hashbazah. And you can tell it's probably, I doubt very much that back in that time they had that long of names. I think that this was specifically a mouthful for a reason. This was to be a message for the people. And so again, it's like his whole life was about, prophesying God's word. His wife was a prophetess, his sons were a sign, and so this was very much a family thing for Isaiah. And it means a remnant shall return. The Shear-Jashub. And we'll talk about that later, but that's a big theme in Isaiah, is this idea of a remnant, because what's going to happen, it's no longer going to be a message about let's bring the whole nation back to the Lord. It's going to be a message about be part of that remnant. Like the kingdom, the Judah's people around you are going bad. Make sure that you're not behaving like they are and to live in a faithful way. So, for example, chapter 8, verse 11, it says, "The Lord spoke thus to me with his strong hand upon me and warned me not to walk in the way of this people." And so that's the kind of message of Isaiah is no longer like the nations around us are all the bad guys. It's like the bad guys are in our houses now. Don't behave like the people in your own kingdom. And so it's a very, very sad situation. But that's going to be Isaiah's message, is trying to reach out and really at least reach what you might call the remnant, those faithful who are going to listen to the Lord. Now, in terms of the structure of the book, Isaiah, the first 5 chapters, they just open up and they just sort of jump into these prophecies. It's just like this very brief introduction. And it says he prophesied in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And that's a long period of time. Uzziah reigns for 52 years, Jotham reigns for 16, Ahaz 16, and Hezekiah 29. So it doesn't do a very good job of pinpointing exactly when these prophecies were. Yeah, Joe.
It talks about Uzziah's reign, and it doesn't record it in the Kings or the Chronicles as being when they had that major earthquake. I think it was like 8.2 or 8.3 on the Richter scale, because they sent archaeologists back to 6 cities that fell because of that earthquake, and they asked them to assess the damage. So it was archaeologists working with seismologists, and they said it was like 8.2, 8.3, which is massive in Israel. So did the earthquake happen in Isaiah's time? And the last question I had was, is this the one that Hebrews 11 is speaking about, of a prophet that was sawn in 2?
So the first question about Uzziah's earthquake, the first time where we have a specific time stamp in Isaiah is in chapter 6, and it's actually when Uzziah dies. So that's kind of, and if you read, we'll look at chapter 6 later, but Isaiah chapter 6, it kind of talks about, he gets commissioned, it seems like, as a prophet the year that Uzziah dies.
I just wonder whether Isaiah predicted the earthquake or whether he lived through it, or...
Not as far as I know. It sounds like in here that he was actually at the very end of Uzziah, because Uzziah reigns for 52 years. He had a long reign. And in Isaiah chapter 6, the first time we really have like a specific time, it just says that it was during the death of Uzziah that he was called to be a prophet of the Lord. That's where the famous passage is, "Here I am, Lord, send me." Right. And the seraphim puts a burning coal on his tongue, all that stuff. That happens during the last year. Actually, it was the year he died. So he probably didn't come on the scene until maybe very late in Uzziah's reign.
And is Hebrews 11 talking about the prophet's son and 2? Is that Isaiah?
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't.
Because I've heard some brothers speculate about that. I just didn't know if you knew. Okay.
That's an interesting question. I hadn't picked up on that. I don't know that we're specifically told how his life ends in the Bible, as far as I know. But yeah, that's a good point, because you have these kings reigning for a long time. The first real timestamp we have is during the last reign, the last year of Uzziah, and so that would be when Jotham officially becomes king. It's kind of a mess. We'll look at that in a minute, but the first 5 chapters, they kind of open up as it just jumps into this prophecy, and it really sets the themes that you're going to see throughout the book, because Isaiah chapters 1 through 5 are going to touch on a couple important themes. One is that he's going to address the sins of the people. 2, he's going to address the judgment that's going to come on the people. And then 3, he's going to talk about the restoration that comes to the people. And so that's going to be, really, you'll see throughout the rest of Isaiah, those are kind of like the things he touches on. It's the idea of like, here's the stuff that you're doing wrong, here's the judgment that's going to come, but there's going to be a remnant that's going to return. And that becomes the recurring theme in Isaiah. And if you look through the first 6 chapters, or first 5 chapters rather, you'll see that. We're not going to read these chapters. Just looking at a few verses to get the idea. Verse 4, for example, it says, well, we can start at verse 2. It says, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth. Children I have reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its master, the donkey its crib, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand." And then it goes on to say, "Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, offspring of evil." And it just goes on about all the things that they're doing. And as you read through Isaiah in the first couple chapters, and just maybe from any background, what are some of the sins that Isaiah specifically calls out? What's one of the big things that he really says is a problem going on? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Joseph.
I thought that Isaiah really focused on their lack of justice throughout their times for not sticking up for the fatherless, the widow, and the foreigner, and that oppression was constant during their time. I think him plus all the other ones is like 285 years they warned Israel, and they went into captivity for the 70 years. And what's interesting is Jonah preached for 3 days and got everybody to repent.
Yeah, but I agree with you. I think that's kind of one of the big sins that you see get brought up over and over again, is just what you call injustice. And to elaborate on that, the injustice was being done. You had these, what you might call vulnerable people. You had widows, you had orphans, and what was happening is that those who weren't vulnerable, the powerful people, the leaders, the wealthy, the people in power, they were taking advantage of them. If you look at chapter 1, starting in verse 12, and it's really an interesting series of verses, because what happens is the Lord, speaking through Isaiah, actually says, you know what, you guys are doing all these things for me. You're trampling my courts. You're bringing in these vain offerings. You're doing all these convocations, and it's like this very empty faith, because at the end of the day, if you look at verse 17, it says, "Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and plead the widow's cause." And so that's a big issue that was going on, is that you had this sort of, the temple worship was going on during this time and things like that, but it was really an empty type of worship, because they were going through the motions and they're bringing their sacrifices and they're doing what the law says, but the fact that they're mistreating people annuls all that. It's like, this is what really matters. And Jesus had an expression for that. Remember what Jesus used when he talked about the law? The weightier measures of the law. Remember what Jesus talked about? That's one of the things, and you'll see Jesus quotes Isaiah a lot, because he really picks up on the same theme in his own generation, is that, you guys are like straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. It's like, this is their religion. They were obsessed with some little nuance in the law, but then they were doing big, bad things. And that's kind of how things were going on in Isaiah's day.
I was just going to say, the one that he picks up on that I think is one of the strongest is Isaiah 29:13. He says, "For these people draw close to me with their hearts, for their mouths, but their hearts are far from me, and their religion is basically only rules taught by men." So even in that day, before you get to the Pharisees and Sadducees adding 500 laws that had nothing to do with the scriptures, it was present at this time. Last thing was, I looked it up. the Talmud does say that Isaiah was executed by the order of King Manasseh and was sawn in two. So I guess it's Uzziah, and then who comes after him?
So it was Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and then Hezekiah. Manasseh would have been Hezekiah's son.
Okay.
So when they assembled this book, he must not have started reigning yet, and that's maybe when.
Okay.
And Manasseh was a bad guy. We know he did a lot of violence, so that seems probable.
But that's what the Talmud says anyway.
Interesting. So that's one of the themes is that, so here's the bad things they're doing, here's what they need to start doing, and you look at the judgment piece of that. You look at chapter 5, verse 13, for example, and it starts talking about what's going to happen. It says, therefore my people go into exile for lack of knowledge, and their honored men go hungry, and the multitude go parched with thirst. Sheol has enlarged its appetites, opened beyond measure, and the nobility of Jerusalem and her multitude will go down. Her revelers will come to exult in her. And this is, if I was to pick like a theme so far, what I think is important is, I think in verse 13, it really talks about, this is Isaiah's message. It says, people go into exile for lack of knowledge. And when I read that verse, when I think of a lack of knowledge, a lot of times what comes in my mind is just like maybe academic knowledge, but I believe that it's not just that. I think there's a lack of self-awareness. And that's what you're going to see throughout the chapter. And I think Joe brought out a very good chapter where he talks about, they're what was that one? Their hearts are far from, yeah. My name is on their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Something like that. But that's, I think, a good concept in Isaiah is just really this lack of self-awareness. It's like they have the knowledge of like the law and those things, but it's understanding what the weightier things are and just having the self-reflection that it takes to understand where the problems are. And then again, on the theme of restoration, and you look at chapter 2, and we're not going to read it, but we read these passages a lot. It talks about, chapter 2, it says that it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, shall be lifted above the hills. Many nations shall flow to it. Many people shall say, let's come to the house of the mountain of the Lord. So it talks about this future where they're going to be restored and they're going to reflect God's glory. Verse 4, it talks about, that he shall judge between the nations. He just decide disputes between the peoples. And so this is the end of everything. So it's really like things are bad right now. Things are going to get worse because I'm going to bring judgment on you. But ultimately, there's going to be a restoration of the remnant. And that's going to be the message here is just making sure that you heed God's prophets. So even though when the exile comes and all the judgment comes, make sure you're part of that remnant that's being faithful. And that's going to be, again, I think a theme you'll see throughout the works of Isaiah. All right, so just again, talking a little bit about setting the background of these kings. We talked about there's 4 kings that reigned during this time. And just really quickly, Uzziah, anybody want to give like a quick synopsis of his reign? What happened with him? Is he a good king, bad king, complex king? And don't feel bad, I had to look up these and remind myself, except for Hezekiah. I know Hezekiah, but some of these smaller kings I always forget.
I believe Uzziah was a very good king for a very long time, and he had a lot of major architectural projects of building cities. He also had a lot of technology where they built new weapons, and then he was the one who, late in life, after all this success, tries to bring a censer offering to the Lord.
Yeah.
Which I'm like, come on, guy, we already have this in the book of Exodus with the 2 sons of Aaron who did this and were burned up, and he gets leprosy, I believe, and is cast out by 80 priests out of the temple. So he has a very bad ending, even though he was a very good king for a long time.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. Yeah, he's a good king. God gives him a lot of victories. Then his head gets big, and he decides he can do the work of the priest. And so he gets leprosy, and he has to live in exile, and then his son Jotham comes on. And Jotham doesn't have a lot of, I don't know what you call press in the Bible, but what little is there, it seems like he was a decent king. There's nothing really bad said about him. There's bad things going on in the kingdom of Judah at this time while he's king, but he himself doesn't seem to be, the agitator. Ahaz. We looked a little bit at him last week, or at least in my exhortation in chapter 7, but Ahaz, he's a bad king. Ahaz is the guy that he basically has all these problems in his life. He gets invaded over and over again, and he just refuses to turn to God. And then there's his son Hezekiah, which is like the flip of that. He gets invaded, he's always turning to the Lord, and he ends up successful. So those guys are almost if you want to look at it, they were sort of I don't know what the term is, not a mirror image, but the opposite of whatever that is, the antitype of one another. But Ahaz was bad, Hezekiah was good, and really in Isaiah, the only kings that you read about him interacting with are, yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick thought. So, Ahaz's grandfather is Uzziah, right?
Ahaz's grandfather is Uzziah, yes.
So it would have been interesting, he would have at least heard the stories of his father being a great man of faith, and but then at the end, he gets leprosy. And so it would have been interesting if in his own mind, as a young man, he would have made a connection in the negative towards why I don't want anything to do with God, because I could follow God all my life and he can just smite me down if you look at it purely in the humanistic mindset.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And when you read about Ahaz and his reign, that's exactly what he does. He looks like the Syrians came in, they were successful. And so what does he do? Oh, I'm going to worship the Syrian gods. and then he, but yeah, he does. And one of the things in Isaiah, again, he interacts really with two of these kings, and we're going to see that their interactions are very different. So for example, if you look at Isaiah chapter 7, verse 3, Isaiah is sent to Ahaz, and how does he go to Ahaz in verse 3? If someone wants to read that verse for us really quickly. Isaiah 7, verse 3.
Then the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out now to meet Ahaz, you and your son Shear-Jashub, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field."
Okay, so when he goes to meet Ahaz, does he go to his house? Does he talk with any of his officials? No, he meets him, he has to basically wait on this highway. And you get at least in my mind, what it sounds like is happening is that he basically has to wait for the king to kind of walk by, and then he starts shouting these things out. That's just the picture I have in my mind, is he doesn't have a relationship with Ahaz. He doesn't have the, the connection that you see. And you contrast that with later on with Hezekiah. If you look at Isaiah chapter 37, in Isaiah 37, verse 5, it says, "When the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, 'Say to your master,'" and it goes on. But when Hezekiah gets into trouble, he sends his officials to Isaiah. And you see that there's a line of communication between Hezekiah and Isaiah that didn't exist with his father Ahaz. And again, if you turn over to chapter 38, verse 1, it says, "In those days Hezekiah became sick and was at the point of death, and Isaiah the prophet of Amoz came to him and said to him," and so again, you get this idea, these guys have a communication that's going on. They're talking through envoys, they're talking in person, he's in his house. Ahaz, on the other hand, when he needs to reach out to him, he has to basically wait at this pool and a highway. You just get the vision, he has to grab this king's attention as he's walking by. And of course, back in Isaiah chapter 7, he asks him for a sign. And then Ahaz I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to test the Lord. He doesn't even want to take part in this. And then that's where he says he'll give him. So anyway, you just get the idea. You can just see the relationship there. All right, so kind of the last thing I'd like to look at is just really the start of Isaiah's calling, if you will. It's Isaiah chapter 6. And the first 5 verses, I just kind of jumps into these prophecies, but starting in chapter 6, this is where you have the calling of Uzziah. And the calling of Isaiah. And chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train and robe filled the temple." And just trying to set the stage, and I think Brother Joseph talked about some of the things. Let's turn back to 2 Chronicles chapter 26. We'll just get an idea of what the time frame was like when this originally takes place, when he's called. So 2 Chronicles 26. 2 26, yeah, starting in verse 16 to verse 23. So 16 to 23, if someone could read that. So Isaiah 26, verses 16 to 23.
But when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction, for he transgressed against the Lord his God and went into the temple of the Lord to burn incense upon the altar of incense. And Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him 80 priests of the Lord that were valiant men. And they withstood Uzziah the king, and they said unto him, It appertaineth not unto thee, Uzziah, to burn incense unto the Lord, but to the priests, the sons of Aaron, that are consecrated to burn incense. Go out of the sanctuary, for thou hast trespassed, neither shall it be for thine honor from the Lord God. Then Uzziah was wroth, and he had a censer in his hand to burn incense. And while he was wroth with the priest, the leprosy even rose up in his forehead before the priest in the house of the Lord from beside the incense altar. And Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked upon him, and behold, he was leprous in his forehead, and they thrust him out from thence. Yea, himself hasted also to go out, because the Lord had smitten him. And Uzziah the king was a leper unto the day of his death, and dwelt in a several house, being a leper. For he was cut off from the house of the Lord, and Jotham his son was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. Now the rest, sorry, where did you say to go to?
Just the end of the chapter.
Okay. Now the rest of the acts of Uzziah, first and last, did Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, write. So Uzziah slept with his father, and they buried him with his fathers in the field of the burial which belonged to the kings. For they said, He is a leper, and Jotham his son reigned in his stead.
Thank you. So you read this incident here. He starts off as a really good king, and the Lord gives him a lot of victory. And if you read the whole chapter, we won't do that, but Uzziah builds up this really strong military. He starts all these building projects, and he's really a prosperous king, and things seem to be really going in the right way. You know, it talks about an army of 307,000 people. They had all these, verse 14, they had shields, spears, helmets. So he's a pretty strong king. Things are really going in his way. And unfortunately, what happened was, it says in verse 16, when he was strong, he grew proud. And that became his downfall. So he goes from being this really, what could have been a great king. You know, he could have been up there with David and Solomon and Hezekiah and some of these others that we consider like the great kings of Israel and Judah. But instead, he makes some bad decisions late in his life, and he decides he wants to go in and offer incense to the Lord, and completely ignores the law of God, ignores the restrictions on the priesthood, things like that. And then he has leprosy. And, you know, yeah.
So I've always wondered why this particular role is so guarded. Like in the time of Aaron, you know, his two sons offer an incense that isn't authorized, they get burned with fire. Here you got Uzziah being struck with leprosy for going in and thinking he could offer it. And you have the guy who touches the ark dies. Is another example of the extremeness in all three cases. People die immediately, and there's nothing left. The word for to consume is a kal in Hebrew, A-K-A-L, and you can be consumed by animals, by the sword, by a plague, by fire, and so each one of them is a kal at the end. But I was like, why is this being guarded so judiciously? Why is it so fine a point with the Lord? And I think it's because Christ was going to be the only example of a priest, prophet, and king where it's all united again. And in every one of these cases, they attempted to cross that line and become what only his son could achieve, priest, prophet, and king. And that's why there's this extremeness with leprosy, with fire, with instant death, because they've crossed over into an area that only Christ could claim.
Good point. I never thought about it that way. Yeah, it certainly ties it to pride, and that's, I guess, an ultimate sense of pride is taking on that messianic role, right? But he ends up getting leprosy, and so what happens is he lives in a separate house, and then his son Jotham becomes kind of the regent. You know, he kind of rules over things, and his father is exiled. We don't know exactly what the time frame is. I've seen some people say that it was the last 11 years of his reign. They kind of look at things in the Kings of Israel, and anyway, but needless to say, this is where Isaiah comes on the scene, is when Uzziah dies. And you got to think about this for a minute. This was a guy who's reigning for 50 years, and so this would have been a big change when you have somebody who's king for that long that dies. You know, think about the United Kingdom. They recently lost a queen. You know, she was even longer. It was over 70 years, right? Something like that. Queen Elizabeth was on the throne. That's a big, shock. You know, when you have someone who's reigning that long and then they pass away. And it's during this time that we see in Isaiah chapter 6 that God calls Isaiah to begin his work. So, do I have time, or am I about out? 3 more minutes? Okay. So, Isaiah chapter 6, and I just, maybe just, if we want to read just verses 4 through 7. Actually, let's go ahead and read 1 through 7 to kind of get an idea of what's happening here. This is the calling of Isaiah. And I don't know if anyone wants to read that. I can. Thanks, Caleb.
In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims, each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, and with twain he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the post of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes shall have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken from the tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth, and said, Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged.
All right, thank you. So it's a very dramatic vision that Isaiah has here. He sees the Lord sitting upon a throne, and when it says the train of his robe, what is it? Do anyone know what the train of a robe is? We don't really wear robes today. I had to kind of look that up. Yeah. Like if you ever see a wedding, a lot of times the brides have these trains that go behind them up the aisle when they go down, and that's the kings would wear these robes. But that's what's happening here. He has this long robe, and it's filling the temple, and it talks about these seraphim, and again, very mysterious. Go ahead.
So on that first verse, I saw the Lord sitting on a high and exalted throne with the edges of his robe filling the temple. If you think about that cloth and the curtain that was in the temple, and when Christ died, God rent his garment, and it tears from top to bottom. And so that is the symbolism of that. This robe filled the temple. That curtain was part of that robe, and it was rent in half. It's really beautiful symbolism.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to wrap your mind around what Isaiah must have seen here. I mean, he's seen the Lord, and it talks about these seraphim, which are these sort of mysterious creatures they have. And again, there's a lot of debate whether there's really seraphim or whether it's just a vision of these things. But in any way, they have 6 wings, and each of the wings does something different. One covers the face, one covers the feet, and with the other they fly. But anyway, so we'll kind of end that there. I know we're out of time, but this is, I've just found it an interesting study. There's just a lot going on in Isaiah. And again, I think his main message is trying to reach out to the people. And you'll see at the end of this chapter 6, the reason that the people didn't have knowledge, it wasn't because it wasn't there, it wasn't because they weren't smart. It tells us in verse 9, Keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their hearts and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. And what you see is kind of a blindness and a dullness, and this is what's keeping them back. It's not just a lack of what's out there, it's just that they don't have this self-awareness. I think that's one of the things that Isaiah and really all the prophets have to work with. And so, but anyway, well, I'll just kind of end it there, but I appreciate the class this morning, all the comments, and thank you.